Hi, Mark here from Excel, and an Italian red wine tasting of a rather left field, off the beaten track, off piste kind of wine, but one actually which is sort of a real headline bottle at the moment, in that it is one of this year's Decanter World Wine Award Best in Shows, of those 50 very best wine of the whatever it was, 18,000 or so that were tested. This is one of them, and it's one of the few at a fairly sensible price. We're selling at just over £16. So it's unusual because every year in the Decanter World Wine Awards there is a bottle made from an Italian grape variety that no one's ever heard of. A couple of years ago it was Biancolella from the island of Ischia, the Calimera, made by Gianatiempo, and no one had ever heard of it, and it was a great wine and we had great fun with that. Well, this is this year's equivalent. This one's red, obviously, and yeah, it's always a bit of an intriguing one trying one of these. And I was going to do this tasting completely blind. I was going to pull the bottle open in front of you and do it completely blind. For reasons I'll explain in a moment, I haven't done that. I've actually needed to pre-taste this before coming and sitting and talking to you about it. The wine is from Casa Setaro. It's called the Fuocoallegro Piedirosso. Checks his notes to the right because I'm not an Italian speaker. And it is from the very lower slopes of Vesuvius. It's technically a Vesuvio on the bottle, and that's obviously in Campania, not far from Naples. The grape is Piedirosso, and I had never heard of it before. I'm not sure that many people have. In fact, if you go to the sort of go-to things on this, this is Jancis's World Companion of Oxford Companion of Wine, and then there's Oz Clarke's famous grapes and wines, which I really recommend. The go-to on grapes. There's barely a mention in it. There's like 20 words on it on each of them, and it just mentions there's about 700 hectares of this stuff grown, which is nothing really for those of you used to using Ordnance Survey maps. That's 7 grid squares, which is just tiny. So this is a real, it's a really undergrown grape, and obviously there's less and less of it every year. There's barely a dozen producers work with it, and Casa Setaro are clearly one of the smallest out there. So it's Italian and it's red, so I was kind of thinking I've got a rough idea what to expect with this. And by and large, all Italian reds, you might just want to put Amarone di Valpolicella on one side for a moment. I kind of have 3 things I think about them. 1, lots of tannins. 2, taste of cherries. The only thing that seems to vary with Italian reds is what sort of cherry it tastes of. And then obviously lots of acid as well, and really high acidity. And whether you're talking about Barolo or Anianico, or up and anything from Tuscany, I mean that's largely true. So I got a rough idea that's what I was expecting with this. I think then the thing that varies is, how does it handle oak? Because this is an unusual wine then in that it is partly put through oak barrels and partly made in amphorae, clay vessels, which obviously used to age the wine but without bringing any real oak effect into them. So I had expected and hoped I was going to do this tasting completely blind. I was going to pull the cork out on the tasting and taste it and talk it through with you without having any real preconceptions of it, apart from having read the review in the DWWA, 3-4 weeks ago. And I was going to do that, and in fact I started filming this. We're now, 20 past 9 at night, and I started doing this about 3 o'clock earlier in the day. And I was going to do that just to sort of describe it blind, but actually 2 things happened. 1, having poured it into the glass, I really wasn't sure it was ready. I really didn't think it was showing of its best, and I thought, I'm going to have to come back to this. I'm not sure I particularly like this. Very difficult to enthuse about a Best in Show wine when it's probably not showing at its best. Secondly, from the little tasting I did on it, I was a bit confused as to what to make of it. So I'm going to try going through that a little bit now, actually. So on the nose, it smells of cherries. I mean, it really does smell of cherries. Quite dark cherries, and it's floral. There's something a bit heathery to it, but I don't know how to describe it. And actually, you get this on the palate as well. I'm a little bit reminded of Chilean Carmenere. There is that sort of slightly indescribable factor about it, slightly spicy, and it's a real mouthful. I try and work on this concept a little bit, that there are sort of a spectrum. I often talk about spectrums of ripeness and things like this, but I think there's one, particularly with the Italian reds, but reds generally, from angular to plush. Now, plush wine is something that's really soft and easy. It's the wine equivalent of just flumping into an old sofa and armchair. doesn't really test you. It's really comfortable. I don't know. Chilean Merlot is a sort of classic example of that. There's no particularly sharp edges to it. It's just easy to glug and swallow, and it's that sort of wine. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've probably got things like Barolo and quite a few of those more difficult Italian reds, things like Taurasi, that are really quite angular. They're spiky, they're tense, they're tight. There's loads of tension in them, and they're really, they're quite testing, challenging wines. And you've got to like that kind of thing. Well, this is definitely down that end of the spectrum. This is not a soft, easy glass of wine on its own. And the thing that I definitely got out of this when I first opened it was those tannins and the acidity are definitely quite prevalent. They will test you a little bit in the mouthful. And when I first opened it inside that first hour, they were just a bit too much. Now this has been open now 4 or 5 hours, and I think this has really opened out. Not so much on the nose, but on the palate, it's just much less tight. It's just much easier. In terms of flavours, it's really quite dark. There's a depth to it. It's definitely red fruit, but it's plum and it's red cherry heading into black cherry. This is not down the really dark end of the spectrum. This is not black currants and blackberries. I mean, it's not Cab Sauv, and it's not really deep Syrah. It's that kind of mid-red to black spectrum, but it's, in terms of mouthfeel, it's got a really good texture to it, a lot of which is coming from those tannins. The tannins are flush, they're ripe, they're really easy on the mouth. I'm just being attacked by the cat off here. Chips, away, leave me alone. It's a testing glass of wine, and actually I've just tried this with a slightly iffy chicken Kiev, and it was really, really good with that. Actually, now having been open for a few hours, it's quite soft, it's quite easy. I think the review from DWA talked a sort of balsamic notes to it. There are extra strange hints in there. As I say, there's sort of Carmenere hint for me in there. I can see the balsamic hint. One of the team at work tasted it, sort of heathery, lavender note to it, almost like that sort of garrigue quality you get in some of the wines from Provence and thereabouts. I'm always a bit cautious about this concept of minerality, as we know, but people talk about this particularly with wines from volcanic soils. There is something in this. There's a sort of dryness and austerity to it. I mean, it's obviously dry, it's a red wine, all the sugar's gone, but there is a real tension to it, which I can't easily describe. And maybe that's minerality, but the overall sense is of a really intriguing, interesting wine. It's medium bodied. Let's not kid ourselves that this is really full in the mouth. This is not a big, heavily oaked Malbec or of that nature. There is a lightness, a tension to it. It's much more full bodied, and it's got more attack to it than something like a Beaujolais or whatever. It's a real, I don't know, I find it really intriguing. And if I'm sounding a bit uncertain about how to describe it, it's because it is a slightly uncertain wine in terms of it's just got a series of characteristics which are a bit unusual. It is unmistakably Italian. It does many of the things, I think, that a good, not particularly oaked Chianti does, and I'm a huge Chianti fan. I think it's a really great glass of wine, and I wouldn't have said that 4 or 5 hours ago. This has been open, and I think it makes all the difference. So for those of you that do buy it, have it, enjoy it, but I definitely would recommend giving it some air. I mean, it's unusual, I think, to tip a bottle of £16 wine into a decanter and leave it for 4 or 5 hours, but I'd be tempted to do so. This has been open, this glass, for 4 or 5 hours. It's really lovely now, but don't put it straight in the glass and drink it. It's quite a long tasting, this one, but go enjoy it. I really have.